Thomas Mitchell kneeled before the two fresh graves, his calloused hands placing wildflowers on the small mounds of earth that now held his entire world. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly, as if mocking his grief with its persistence to shine. 6 months had passed since the fever took Sarah and little Emma, but the wound in his heart remained as raw as the day he'd lost them. "I'll be seeing you both someday," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. Thomas hadn't spoken much since the funeral. The ranch hands kept their distance, understanding that some pains couldn't be soothed by words. Rising to his full height, Thomas surveyed his land, 200 acres of cattle ranch that had once represented his dream and now felt like an empty promise. The house stood in the distance, too large and too quiet for a man alone. Every room held memories. Emma's laughter, echoing down the hallway, Sarah's humming as she prepared meals in the kitchen. That evening, Thomas sat at his desk, a lamp casting long shadows across the room. He pulled out a sheet of paper and dipped his pen in ink. His hand trembled slightly as he began to write. "To the Tucson Children's Home, I am writing to inquire about adopting a boy, preferably around 8 years of age. I own a cattle ranch outside Willow Creek and can provide a good home. I was blessed with a daughter, but she has passed. I believe I could offer guidance to a boy who needs a family. Respectfully, Thomas Mitchell." He read over the letter twice before folding it carefully and sealing it with wax. Tomorrow, he would ride into town and send it by telegram. Thomas had never considered himself a particularly soft man. Ranching required grit and determination, but Sarah's last words haunted him. "Don't let your heart turn to stone, Thomas," she had whispered, her fever-bright eyes locked on his. "Promise me you'll find love again." He hadn't promised. He couldn't. But perhaps in raising a child, a boy who could learn the ways of the ranch and carry on after Thomas was gone, he might fulfill some part of Sarah's wish. As he prepared for bed, Thomas paused at Emma's room. The small bed remained made with the patchwork quilt Sarah had sewn. Her rag doll sat propped against the pillow, forever waiting for a child who would never return. With a heavy sigh, Thomas closed the door. Maybe soon another child's presence would help chase away the ghosts that haunted these halls. Sleep eluded him that night, as it often did. Thomas stared at the ceiling, wondering if he was making the right decision. What did he know about raising a child alone? Sarah had been the one with patience and warmth, but the alternative, continuing this half-life of grief and isolation, seemed unbearable. If nothing else, having a boy around would give him purpose beyond the daily operations of the ranch. As dawn broke, Thomas rose with renewed determination. He would send the letter today, and perhaps soon the empty spaces in his home would echo with a child's footsteps once more. Willow Creek's train station was hardly more than a platform with a small shelter, but today, it buzzed with unusual activity. Thomas stood apart from the small crowd, adjusting his collar nervously. The telegram from the orphanage had arrived just 3 days ago. Boy arriving Wednesday noon train. Papers enclosed require signature. In his pocket was a small wooden horse he'd carved over the past evenings, sanding it smooth until his fingers ached. A simple gift, but he hoped it might ease the transition for the boy. Billy was his name, according to the paperwork. The distant whistle announced the train's approach, and Thomas straightened his hat. He wasn't sure what to expect, having only specified a boy around 8. He watched as the locomotive pulled into the station, belching steam and smoke into the clear Arizona sky. Passengers began to disembark, a businessman in a city suit, a young couple, an elderly woman assisted by the conductor. Thomas scanned for a lone child, perhaps escorted by an orphanage official. Then, near the end of the passenger car, he spotted a small figure, a boy with sandy hair clutching a threadbare satchel. But the boy wasn't alone. Beside him stood a woman, thin as a rail with dark circles under her eyes. Her dress was simple but clean, her hair pulled back severely into a bun. She gripped the boy's shoulder protectively, her eyes darting nervously around the platform until they landed on Thomas, who had stepped forward with the wooden horse visible in his hand. "You must be from the orphanage," Thomas said, addressing the woman as they approached. "I'm Thomas Mitchell." The woman didn't respond. She simply reached into her pocket and produced a folded paper, which she handed to him with trembling fingers. It was the adoption authorization he'd received in the mail, now bearing a signature: Elizabeth Hargrove, guardian of William Hargrove. Thomas frowned. "There seems to be some confusion. I arranged to adopt a boy, not—" He gestured awkwardly at the woman. The boy, Billy, looked up at Thomas with large eyes. "Are you the rancher, sir?" Thomas nodded, crouching down to Billy's level. "I am. And you must be Billy." "Yes, sir. And this is, my mother." Thomas stood abruptly. "Your mother?" The telegram said nothing about a mother. He looked at the woman, Elizabeth, with confusion. "Ma'am, there appears to be a misunderstanding." Elizabeth remained silent, her eyes cast downward. "My mama doesn't talk," Billy explained matter-of-factly. "Not since the bad times." Thomas ran a hand through his hair in frustration. This was not what he had planned, not what he had prepared for. He'd opened his heart just enough to take in a boy who needed a home, not a woman with her own complicated past. "I need to sort this out," Thomas said firmly. "The telegram clearly stated I was adopting an orphan boy." Elizabeth finally looked up, her eyes meeting his. They were a deep blue, startling in their intensity despite the fatigue evident on her face. She made a small gesture with her hands, then pointed to Billy, then to herself, then made a motion as if tying something. "Together. We come together," Billy translated. "The orphanage said so." Thomas sighed deeply. "Let me send a telegram to clarify this situation. In the meantime, you can wait at the hotel." Elizabeth shook her head firmly, her expression suddenly alarmed. She clutched Billy closer. "Mama says we stay together," Billy insisted. "Always." Thomas looked between them, noting the woman's worn appearance and the boy's hopeful face. Whatever had happened to render this woman mute, it clearly hadn't diminished her determination to protect her son. "All right," Thomas conceded reluctantly. "You can both come to the ranch while I sort this out. But this is temporary, you understand?" Elizabeth nodded, relief washing over her features. As they walked toward Thomas's wagon, he wondered what exactly he'd gotten himself into, and how quickly he could resolve this unexpected complication. The ride to the ranch was mostly silent, broken only by Billy's occasional questions about the landscape or animals they passed. Thomas answered automatically, his mind still grappling with the situation. Elizabeth sat rigid beside her son, her gaze fixed ahead, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Whatever her story was, Thomas suspected it wasn't a happy one. The first week passed in awkward adjustment. Thomas had sent 3 telegrams to the orphanage but received no replies. With each passing day, the likelihood of a quick resolution diminished, and the reality of housing both Billy and his silent mother settled uncomfortably around the ranch. Thomas had given Elizabeth the guest room and placed Billy in a small room that had once been used for storage. He found himself tiptoeing around his own home, unsettled by the presence of the quiet woman who moved like a ghost through his hallways. Elizabeth rose before dawn each morning, and Thomas often found the kitchen fire already stoked and coffee brewing when he came downstairs. She kept the house meticulously clean, repaired torn shirts he'd tossed aside, and prepared simple but hearty meals, all without a single word. On the 7th day, Thomas entered the kitchen to find her struggling with his cast-iron stove, which had a tricky damper that even Sarah had cursed at occasionally. "Here, let me," he said, reaching past her to adjust it. Elizabeth flinched violently at his proximity, stumbling backward against the table. Thomas raised his hands, stepping back. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to startle you." Her breathing steadied, but her eyes remained wary. Thomas noticed, not for the first time, the small scars on her hands and wrists, thin white lines that spoke of old injuries. She nodded slightly in acknowledgement of his apology and gestured toward the stove questioningly. Slowly, as if approaching a spooked horse, Thomas demonstrated how to work the damper, It sticks sometimes. You need to lift it slightly before turning. Elizabeth watched intently, then tried it herself, succeeding on the second attempt. A small smile touched her lips, and she nodded in thanks. Later that morning, Thomas took Billy to the barn, deciding the boy should learn something useful if he was to stay for a while. "Have you ever been around horses, son?" Thomas asked as they approached the stables. "No, sir," Billy replied, eyeing the large animals with a mixture of fear and fascination. "We lived in the city before we had to leave." Thomas chose not to press for details. Instead, he lifted the boy onto a fence rail and showed him how to hold out his palm flat, with a carrot for his gentlest mare. "Don't curl your fingers," he instructed. "Keep them straight so she doesn't accidentally nip you." Billy giggled as the horse's velvety lips tickled his palm. It was the first genuinely joyful sound Thomas had heard in his home since Emma's passing, and it struck him like a physical blow. He turned away, blinking rapidly. "Mr. Mitchell?" Billy's voice was small. "Are you all right?" Thomas composed himself before turning back. "Yes, just got some dust in my eye. Now, would you like to help me feed the rest of them?" That afternoon, as Thomas split wood outside, he noticed Elizabeth watching from the window. When their eyes met, she didn't look away. Instead, she raised her hand in a small wave. Thomas found himself returning the gesture before he realized what he was doing. That night, a cold front swept in from the north, bringing the first hint of the approaching winter. Thomas added extra logs to the fires and left additional blankets outside the doors to their rooms. As he passed Elizabeth's room, he heard her coughing softly. Before he could think better of it, Thomas knocked gently. After a moment, the door opened slightly, and Elizabeth's questioning face appeared. "I heard you coughing," he explained, suddenly feeling foolish. "There's a chest balm Sarah, my wife, used to make. It might help. I'll leave it here." He placed a small tin on the hallway table. Elizabeth's eyes softened. She reached out hesitantly and touched his arm, just the lightest pressure of her fingertips, before withdrawing back into her room. That night, lying awake in his bed, Thomas realized it was the first time anyone had touched him with gentleness since Sarah died. The thought both comforted and disturbed him in equal measure. 2 weeks into their stay, the skies opened in a deluge that trapped them all indoors. Rain lashed against the windows and thunder rattled the panes. By nightfall, the storm had intensified, and Thomas secured the shutters against the howling wind. "Will the animals be okay?" Billy asked anxiously, as a particularly loud crack of thunder shook the house. "They're safe in the barn," Thomas assured him. "Those walls have withstood worse than this." Elizabeth sat in a corner chair, mending one of Billy's shirts by lamplight. Thomas had noticed how the boy's clothes, though clean and carefully maintained, were becoming too small. Tomorrow, he decided, he would bring down some of his own childhood clothes from the attic. His mother had preserved them in cedar chests, and though they'd be old-fashioned, they would fit the boy better. As the evening wore on, Billy fell asleep on the sofa near the fire. Thomas gently lifted him to carry him to bed. "He's getting heavier," Thomas commented as he adjusted his hold on the sleeping child. Elizabeth nodded, a fond expression softening her features as she watched her son. She rose to follow Thomas, turning down Billy's bed covers as Thomas laid him down. The domestic choreography felt natural, and for a moment, Thomas allowed himself to imagine this was his family, that the years of loneliness were behind him. The thought sent a jolt of guilt through him. He stepped back abruptly, nearly colliding with Elizabeth. "I should check the livestock one more time," he muttered, despite the raging storm. Elizabeth frowned and shook her head, gesturing toward the windows where rain streamed in torrents. She placed a restraining hand on his arm, her expression clearly conveying, "Don't be foolish." Thomas sighed. "You're right, it can wait until morning." They returned to the main room in awkward silence. Thomas added another log to the fire while Elizabeth resumed her seat, picking up her mending. The howling wind and drumming rain filled the silence between them. "I lost my wife and daughter to fever last winter," Thomas said suddenly, surprising himself. He hadn't spoken of them to anyone in months. Emma was 6. She loved storms, used to say the thunder was angels moving furniture. Elizabeth looked. Up her needle paused mid-stitch. Her eyes held neither pity nor empty consolation, just quiet understanding. Sarah, my wife. She fought it for nearly 2 weeks. Emma was gone in 3 days. Thomas stared into the fire. The doctor said some bodies fight harder, but I think Emma just couldn't bear to stay behind without her mother. Elizabeth set aside her mending and reached for the small slate and chalk she'd taken to carrying. She wrote carefully, "They are still with you." Thomas read it and nodded. "In some ways. In others, this place feels emptier than ever." He looked around the room. Until recently, that is. A crash of thunder, louder than any before, shook the house to its foundations. The lights flickered, and somewhere upstairs, a window shutter broke free, banging violently against the side of the house. "I need to secure that," Thomas said, standing quickly. As he reached the top of the stairs, a blood-curdling scream froze him in place. It came again, raw and terrified, from Elizabeth's room. Thomas rushed down the hall and threw open her door without thinking. Elizabeth was tangled in her bedsheets, her eyes wide but unseeing, her mouth open in another silent scream. Her body convulsed as if fighting off an attacker. Thomas approached cautiously. "Elizabeth," he called firmly. "Elizabeth, you're dreaming, you're safe." Her eyes focused on him, wild with terror. For the first time, Thomas heard her voice, broken and hoarse as if scraped raw. "Don't touch him, please." Thomas remained very still. "No one will hurt Billy. He's safe, Elizabeth. You're both safe here." Recognition slowly dawned in her eyes. Her breathing calmed, but tears streamed down her face. She clutched her throat, seeming shocked at the sound that had escaped her. Thomas backed toward the door. "I'll make some tea," he said gently. "Take your time." The morning after the storm, Thomas approached Elizabeth as she hung laundry in the yard, taking advantage of the returned sunshine. He handed her a paper-wrapped package. "I thought you might find this useful," he said simply. Elizabeth untied the string and unwrapped a leather-bound notebook, nicer than the small slate she'd been using. Inside were crisp, blank pages and a good pencil tucked into the binding. She looked up at him questioningly. "It's easier than the slate," Thomas explained. "More room to write, and you can save the pages if you need to." Elizabeth traced the leather cover with her fingertips, then opened to the first page. Carefully, she wrote in a neat, educated hand, "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. This is very thoughtful." "Thomas," he corrected. "If you're staying for a while, you might as well use my given name." She nodded and added beneath her first message, "Thank you, Thomas." That simple exchange marked a turning point. Over the following days, Elizabeth began to use the notebook frequently, not just for necessary communication, but to share observations and even occasional jokes. Thomas learned she had a sharp wit and a keen eye for detail. One evening as they sat by the fire, Billy already asleep upstairs, she wrote, "Your cattle in the south pasture have found a weak spot in the fence. 2 escaped yesterday." Thomas looked up surprised. "How did you know that?" She smiled slightly and wrote, "I watch everything, old habit." "A useful habit on a ranch," Thomas admitted. "I'll have the hands check the fence tomorrow." Elizabeth hesitated, then wrote something else. "Billy loves it here. He's never had space to run before." Thomas felt a swell of satisfaction. "He's a good boy. Quick learner, too. He's already figured out how to saddle my old mare." Pride shone in Elizabeth's eyes as she nodded. She turned to a new page and, after a long pause, began to write more than she ever had before. Thomas waited patiently, watching her pencil move across the paper. When she finally turned the notebook toward him, he read, "I know you've been wondering about us, about why I cannot speak. I was not born this way. 3 years ago, after my first husband died, I remarried. He was respected, powerful, but behind closed doors, he was cruel. When I tried to leave, taking Billy, he Here the writing became unsteady. The letters pressed harder into the page. She continued, "He caught us. He said if I ever used my voice to tell anyone what happened in our home, he would ensure I'd never see Billy again. He had the power to do it." That night, his hands around my throat, something broke inside. When he finally let go, my voice was gone. The doctors said it was shock. He told everyone I had suffered a nervous collapse. After that, I stopped trying to speak. Even when I could feel words forming, I choked them back. It became easier to be silent than to remember his threats. Thomas felt a cold rage building inside him as he read. He looked up to find Elizabeth watching him anxiously, as if fearing his judgment, or worse, his disbelief. "No one will ever hurt you like that again," he said, his voice low and fierce. "Not while I draw breath." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. She took the notebook back and wrote, "We cannot stay forever. He's still looking for us." "How can you be sure? A man like him doesn't forgive what he sees as betrayal. His pride wouldn't allow it." Thomas considered this. "Does anyone know you came to Arizona?" She shook her head. "Then perhaps you're safer here than you think," he suggested. "This ranch is remote. People in town mind their own business." Elizabeth wrote again, "I don't want to bring danger to your door. My door, my choice," Thomas replied firmly. He hesitated, then added more gently, "Besides, Billy needs stability and you both need time to heal." Elizabeth studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally she wrote, "You are a good man, Thomas Mitchell." "I'm trying to be," he answered honestly. The days grew shorter and cooler as October gave way to November. The ranch settled into a rhythm that increasingly included both Elizabeth and Billy as more than temporary guests. Thomas had stopped sending telegrams to the orphanage weeks ago. Billy followed Thomas everywhere, absorbing lessons about ranching. With an enthusiasm that made the old hand smile, he'd taken to calling Thomas Mr. Thomas, in a tone of such reverence that Thomas had to hide his pleasure behind a gruff exterior. "Mr. Thomas, can I help with the branding tomorrow?" Billy asked one evening as they returned from checking fence lines. "Branding's hard work, son," Thomas replied, "and dangerous if you don't know what you're doing." "I learn quick," Billy insisted, "and I'm stronger than I look." Thomas ruffled the boy's hair, a gesture that had become natural over the weeks. "We'll see. Maybe you can help Jenkins keep the tally." Billy beamed as if he'd been offered the most important job on the ranch. As they approached the house, the smell of fresh bread greeted them. Thomas had almost forgotten what it was like to return home to cooking smells and a warm hearth. Inside, Elizabeth was placing the final dish on the table. She looked up as they entered, her face transformed with a smile. "Something smells mighty fine in here," Thomas said, hanging his hat by the door. "Mama made stew like your wife used to," Billy announced. "She found the recipe in that book on the shelf." Thomas paused, surprised. The cookbook had been Sarah's prized possession. He hadn't opened it since her passing. Elizabeth held up her notebook. "I hope you don't mind. Sarah would be pleased to see her recipes being used again." Dinner that night was the most comfortable they'd shared yet. Billy chattered about his day, while Thomas and Elizabeth exchanged glances over the boy's head, the silent communication of parents indulging a child's enthusiasm. Parents. The word entered Thomas's mind unbidden, and he quickly pushed it away. These arrangements were still temporary, he reminded himself, even if no one acknowledged it anymore. After Billy went to bed, Thomas and Elizabeth sat by the fire. On this night, Thomas noticed she seemed preoccupied, writing and then scratching out words several times. "Something on your mind?" he asked. Elizabeth hesitated, then turned the notebook toward him. She had drawn a simple sketch of the ranch house, surrounded by trees that weren't there. Beneath it, she'd written, "The west side would be perfect for an orchard. Apple and peach trees would thrive with the water from the creek." Thomas raised his eyebrows. "An orchard? That's thinking long-term." She blushed slightly and started to cross out the words, but Thomas gently stopped her hand. "I like it," he said. "Sarah always wanted fruit trees. I never got around to planting them." Elizabeth wrote quickly. "We could start in spring. Billy and I could help." Thomas noted the "we" and "could" with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Spring's a ways off yet," he said carefully. She nodded, turning to a new page. After a pause, she wrote his name, Thomas. Then beside it, she drew a small heart. The simple gesture struck him like lightning. Thomas stared at the page, his throat suddenly tight. When he looked up, Elizabeth was watching him, vulnerability and something deeper in her eyes. "Elizabeth," he began, not knowing what he wanted to say. She shook her head slightly and took the notebook back, writing, "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that you've made me feel safe for the first time in years." Thomas stood abruptly, moving to the fireplace. Emotions he'd kept buried since Sarah's death threatened to overwhelm him. Grief and guilt mingled with a new, tentative hope. He wasn't ready. "It's getting late," he said, his voice rough. "We should turn in." Elizabeth's face fell, but she nodded, gathering her notebook. As she passed him on her way to the stairs, she paused and lightly touched his arm before withdrawing to her room. After she left, Thomas poured himself a small whiskey and stared into the dying fire. If Sarah were here, what would she tell him? Would she give him permission to open his heart again? "It's too soon," he whispered to himself. "Too complicated." The first snow of winter dusted the ranch in early December. Billy woke Thomas at dawn, his excitement impossible to contain. Mr. Thomas, it's snowing." Thomas groaned good-naturedly. "So I see, and at this ungodly hour too." After breakfast, they ventured into the snow-covered yard. Thomas caught Elizabeth watching from the window and gestured for her to join them. The morning passed in a blur of snowballs and laughter. For a few precious hours, they were simply a family enjoying the season's first snow. Later, Thomas announced he needed to ride into town for supplies. Billy eagerly asked to come along, and with Elizabeth's approval, they set off together. In Willow Creek, Thomas left Billy at the general store while he visited the post office. The postmaster, Perkins, greeted him warmly. "Mitchell, haven't seen you in weeks, got some letters for you." As Thomas turned to leave with his mail, Perkins called him back. "Almost forgot. This came in for posting at the sheriff's office." He handed Thomas a notice. "Sheriff asked all of us to keep an eye out." Thomas's blood ran cold as he stared at the paper. Under the bold heading "Wanted," there was a crude sketch of a woman who could easily be Elizabeth, alongside the words, "Elizabeth Hargrove, for the abduction of William Hargrove. Reward of $500 for information leading to their return to Judge James Hargrove of Pennsylvania." "Something wrong, Mitchell?" Perkins asked, noting Thomas's pallor. "No," Thomas said quickly, folding the notice and stuffing it in his pocket. "Oh, just reminded me of someone is all." He collected Billy and hurried through the remainder of their errands. Back at the ranch, he waited until Billy was occupied with the ranch hands before seeking out Elizabeth in the kitchen. "We need to talk," he said quietly, placing the wanted notice on the table between them. Elizabeth's face drained of color as she read it. Her hands trembled violently. "Is he right?" Thomas asked directly. "Did you kidnap Billy?" Elizabeth's eyes flashed with anger. She wrote furiously, "No! Billy is my son from my first marriage. James is his stepfather, not his father. The birth certificate proves it." "Then, why does the notice claim otherwise? James has connections in law enforcement. He can make documents say whatever he wants. When William died, I had nothing. James offered marriage and security. I didn't know what he was really like until after the wedding. He started criticizing Billy for being too sensitive. Then came punishments, belt whippings for the smallest infractions. And when you tried to interfere?" Elizabeth touched her throat briefly, then wrote, "The same but worse. And threats about sending Billy to a reform school where they'd make a man of him. So you ran." One night he went too far. Billy spilled ink on James's papers. James broke his arm. We left that night with nothing but what we could carry. The orphanage? A stop along the way. When your letter came seeking a boy to adopt, the matron suggested it might be a solution, somewhere remote where James wouldn't look. Elizabeth wrote desperately, "We'll leave tonight. I won't bring danger to your door." "No," Thomas said firmly. "Running now would only make you more vulnerable. Winter's setting in. You have nowhere to go." But the notice makes no mention of Arizona, Thomas pointed out. "I doubt he knows you're here." Thomas reached across the table and took her hand. "Elizabeth, I won't let anyone take Billy from you, or you from this home." She searched his face, hope warring with fear in her eyes. That night, after Elizabeth and Billy had gone to bed, Thomas sat alone by the fire, the wanted notice burning. To ash in the grate, the protective rage he felt surprised him with its intensity. "I won't lose another family," he whispered to the flames. "Not to fever, not to a man who uses law to mask cruelty." Sheriff Daniels was a man whose weathered face reflected decades of frontier justice. He listened without interruption as Thomas explained the situation, carefully omitting Elizabeth's name. "So this woman and her boy," the sheriff said when Thomas had finished. "They're staying at your place now?" Thomas nodded. "They've become important to me. Never thought I'd see the day Thomas Mitchell opened his home again." "What do you know about Pennsylvania judges?" Thomas asked. "Depends on the judge. Some are decent men. Others," he spat into a nearby spittoon. "Power corrupts, especially when it's wrapped in respectability. If such a man came looking for a woman and child he claimed were his, I'd need to see papers," Daniels said carefully. "Official documents have weight even out here." He paused. "Course, papers can be lost, telegraphs delayed." Thomas felt a surge of hope. "So you might move slowly?" "I might, especially if the woman and child seemed well settled with a respected rancher." He fixed Thomas with a pointed look. "But if this judge is as connected as you suggest, he might bring men with badges or guns." "I understand. Do you?" "Because helping a woman keep her child from a man with legal claim could be construed as kidnapping. You could lose everything." Thomas thought of Elizabeth's silent strength, of Billy's growing confidence. "Some things are worth the risk." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Old Abe Hutchins has that cabin up in Coyote Canyon. Been empty since he passed. Might be a good place for someone to lay low if trouble comes." That evening, Thomas shared what he had learned with Elizabeth. She listened intently, her eyes growing fearful. "We should leave," she wrote, "before we bring trouble to you." "And go where? With winter setting in and a child to protect?" Elizabeth had no answer. "I've thought this through," Thomas continued. "Sheriff Daniels suggested a cabin in the mountains. If we learn your husband is coming, you and Billy can hide there until we resolve the situation." "How will we resolve it?" Elizabeth wrote skeptically. "I've written to my sister in California. Her husband is a lawyer. If we can prove the abuse, if there are witnesses who saw Billy's broken arm, we might build a case." Elizabeth shook her head. "James will deny everything, his word against mine, and I cannot speak." "Then we'll find another way," Thomas insisted. "You have options beyond running forever." Elizabeth studied him, then wrote, "Why are you doing this? Taking such risks for us?" Thomas had asked himself the same question. The answer had become increasingly clear. "Because when you arrived," he said carefully, "this was just a house. You and Billy, you've made it a home again." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. She wrote something in her notebook, then closed it without showing him. Rising, she impulsively kissed his cheek before hurrying upstairs. Thomas sat stunned, his hand rising to the spot where her lips had touched. The next morning, Thomas woke to find Elizabeth and Billy gone. Panic gripped him until he spotted the notebook left on the kitchen table. Opening it, he read, "We've gone to check the old Hutchins cabin. Billy thinks it's an adventure. I couldn't bear the thought of leaving. Without a plan, you've shown me what it means to stand and fight rather than always run. We'll return by nightfall. P.S. Last night I wanted to write, 'I think I'm falling in love with you,' but I was too afraid. Now, in your absence, I can leave these words for you to find." Thomas read the postscript twice, his heart hammering. The admission mirrored his own growing feelings. When they returned that evening, Thomas met them at the door. He embraced Billy, then turned to Elizabeth. Their eyes met in silent communication. "The cabin will do if necessary," Thomas said simply. "But this is your home for as long as you want it to be." Elizabeth nodded, a smile touching her lips. For now, it was enough. January brought bitter cold and news that chilled Thomas's blood. Someone had been asking after a woman and child, matching Elizabeth and Billy's description. That night, Thomas helped them pack essentials for the Hutchins cabin. Billy hugged him fiercely before climbing into the wagon. "You'll come soon?" Billy asked anxiously. "As often as I can," Thomas promised. "This won't be for long." Elizabeth left her notebook open. "Be careful. James is dangerous when crossed." "So am I," Thomas replied quietly. He watched the wagon disappear into darkness, driven by his trusted ranch hand. The house felt instantly emptier without them. The following day, Thomas rode into town. At the saloon, he found Sheriff Daniels nursing a whiskey. "He's here," the sheriff confirmed. "Checked into the hotel yesterday. Calls himself Judge James Hargrove of the Pennsylvania Superior Court." "Has he spoken to you officially?" "Not yet. Been asking around town, showing a photograph, offering money for information." The sheriff finished his drink. "But he's bringing reinforcements. A federal marshal arriving on tomorrow's train." Thomas felt his stomach sink. A local sheriff? Might look the other way, but a federal marshal would have jurisdiction throughout the territory. That evening, as Thomas prepared to leave town, a cultured voice called out from the shadows. "Mr. Mitchell, I presume?" A man stepped into the lamplight, tall, with silver at his temples and cold eyes. He carried a silver-headed cane that seemed more weapon than walking aid. "Judge Hargrove," Thomas acknowledged, keeping his voice neutral. "My reputation precedes me." "Good. That should make this conversation efficient." "I have nothing to discuss with you." "I believe you do," Hargrove countered smoothly. "A woman and a boy. My wife and my stepson. I believe you're harboring them." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Several people mentioned a woman and child staying at your ranch. A woman who doesn't speak." The judge twirled his cane. "Rather distinctive." "If they left you," Thomas said carefully, "perhaps there was a reason." The judge's eyes hardened. "Elizabeth is mentally unstable since a nervous collapse. She's not fit to make decisions for herself or the boy." "Is that why she doesn't speak? A nervous collapse? So you have seen them. Tell me where they are, and I'll ensure your cooperation is noted favorably." "And if I've nothing to tell you?" "Then the federal marshal will search every inch of your property. This can be easy or difficult, Mr. Mitchell. But I will reclaim what's mine." Thomas rode back to the ranch at a gallop, his mind racing. Doc Wilson was waiting when Thomas arrived, sent by Sheriff Daniels. "You treated a lot of injuries over the years, Doc, including those not always caused by accidents." Wilson agreed. He produced medical documents. "Hypothetically, if I had examined patients with signs of abuse, particularly injuries to the throat severe enough to affect speech, such documentation might be persuasive to authorities." The next morning, Thomas gathered several respected townsmen in the saloon and explained Elizabeth's situation. Some seemed skeptical until Doc Wilson confirmed the medical evidence. Suddenly, Judge Hargrove entered with a federal marshal. "Gentlemen," Hargrove announced, "allow me to present my case." He produced documents proving his marriage and guardianship, plus medical reports of Elizabeth's nervous condition. The marshal stepped forward. "By federal authority, I am authorized to retrieve Elizabeth and William Hargrove." Doc Wilson produced his medical journal. "I've documented evidence of physical trauma consistent with abuse." The telegraph operator stepped forward with a telegram. "This states that no physician in Philadelphia has diagnosed Mrs. Hargrove with any mental condition, and the signatures on the medical reports appear fraudulent." Hargrove's face darkened. "This is absurd. I am a respected judge, who apparently—" "Forged medical documents," Sheriff Daniels interjected. "Tell them," Thomas suggested quietly, "how you broke a boy's arm for spilling ink, how you crushed your wife's throat until she could no longer speak." "You know nothing," Hargrove snarled. She was mine to discipline as I saw fit. Shocked, silence fell. Even the marshal stepped back, reassessing the man he'd accompanied. "Draw your gun and you're a dead man," Sheriff Daniels warned. His weapon pointed at Hargrove, who had reached inside his coat. Hargrove raised a derringer and fired at Thomas. The shot went wide. In the ensuing struggle, Hargrove slashed Thomas with a concealed knife. As darkness clouded his vision, Thomas heard the sheriff. "Get Doc Wilson, Mitchell's been stabbed." His last thought before losing consciousness was of Elizabeth and Billy, waiting for him to return with news that they were finally safe. Thomas awoke in Doc Wilson's surgery 3 days later. "Hargrove?" he asked weakly. "In custody," Sheriff Daniels answered. The marshal was disturbed by his behavior, took him back to face charges of attempted murder, forgery, and other offenses. "And the warrant for Elizabeth and Billy?" "Suspended pending investigation. It'll likely be dismissed once Hargrove's deceptions come to light." Thomas tried to sit up but was gently restrained by the doctor. "I need to tell them," he insisted. "They're waiting. I sent Jenkins to the cabin yesterday," the sheriff assured him. "They know Hargrove's been arrested. Jenkins will bring them to town today." That afternoon, Thomas heard a commotion outside the doctor's office. Then the door burst open, and Billy ran in, stopping short at the sight of Thomas in the bed. "Mr. Thomas, you're hurt." The boy's eyes filled with tears. "Just a scratch," Thomas reassured him, holding out his hand. "Come here, son." Billy threw himself against Thomas's good side, hugging him fiercely. "Jenkins said you fought a bad man for us." "We all did," Thomas corrected, looking up as Elizabeth appeared in the doorway. She stood frozen, her face pale, eyes taking in his bandaged state. Then she was moving, crossing the room in quick steps. She knelt beside the bed, her hands hovering over him as if afraid to touch him. "I'm all right," Thomas told her gently. "Truly." Elizabeth shook her head, tears streaming down her face. She pressed her forehead against their joined hands, overwhelmed with relief. "It's over," Thomas continued. "Hargrove is in custody. The marshal has suspended the warrants. You're safe now, both of you." Doc Wilson quietly ushered Billy out, giving them privacy. In the silence that followed, Thomas stroked Elizabeth's hair, allowing her the release she had denied herself for so long. When she finally looked up, her blue eyes were clearer than he'd ever seen them, as if a weight had been lifted from her very soul. "I should have sent you away that first day at the train station," Thomas said softly. Elizabeth shook her head, emphatically. "No?" Thomas teased gently. "You wouldn't have preferred a less dramatic introduction to Arizona?" She pointed to him, then to herself and Billy, then made a gesture of bringing them together. "Fate?" Thomas guessed. Elizabeth nodded, then touched her heart and pointed to him. "I know," Thomas whispered. "I read what you wrote in the notebook. I feel the same way." Her eyes widened in surprise, then softened. She leaned forward hesitantly, and Thomas met her halfway, their lips touching in a gentle kiss that spoke of new beginnings. When they parted, Elizabeth touched her throat, her expression suddenly determined. She opened her mouth, and Thomas prepared himself for the familiar silence. Instead, a raspy whisper emerged. "Thomas. My home." Thomas stared in amazement. "Elizabeth, you spoke?" She nodded, her face radiant despite the effort those 3 words had clearly cost her. "Free now," she whispered, touching her throat again. "We all free." Doc Wilson, returning with Billy, overheard the exchange and beamed. "Well, I'll be. Seems the voice can return when the cause of its loss is removed." Billy rushed forward. "Mama, you talked." Elizabeth nodded, holding out her arms for her son. As the 3 of them embraced, carefully mindful of Thomas's injury, Doc Wilson discreetly withdrew, leaving the newly formed family to their private joy. 6 months later, spring blossomed across the ranch. Thomas and Elizabeth watched as ranch hands planted their apple orchard. "Still think we need more peach trees," Thomas commented, his arm around her waist. "Next year," she replied, her voice stronger now, though still soft. Daily practice had gradually restored her speech, each word a victory over the fear that had silenced her for so long. Billy raced past them, chasing his new puppy. His laughter, free and unguarded, filled the air, a sound that had become wonderfully common at the Mitchell Ranch. "Did you ever think," Elizabeth asked, "that a misunderstood telegram would lead to this?" "Best mistake that ever happened to me," Thomas answered honestly. Elizabeth turned in his arms. "I love you," she said clearly. Words first expressed in writing, now spoken aloud. "And I love you," he replied. "Both of you." As they walked toward the house, Billy running ahead, Thomas reflected on their journey from grief and fear to this moment of profound contentment. The ranch, once barren in his eyes, now flourished with promise. The silent woman had found her voice, and Thomas Mitchell, who had vowed never to open his heart again, discovered that some vows were made to be broken.
As the sun sets on our story of Thomas, Elizabeth, and Billy, we're reminded that family isn't always what we expect. Sometimes it's what we find when we least expect it. Thomas opened his door, thinking he would adopt a boy, but instead found a complete family waiting to heal his wounded heart. Elizabeth arrived unable to speak, but found her voice in the safety of true love. What unexpected blessings have appeared in your life disguised as complications? When has a misunderstanding led you to something beautiful you never would have found otherwise? Life's most precious gifts often come to us through detours we never planned to take. Share your thoughts in the comments below about a time when the unexpected changed your life for the better. Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next story about a mixed-blood maid who was beaten in public, but an Apache warrior gets in her way.